little lesson I've entitled Why Believe Jesus? As Jesus will do this for us, he'll outline, kind of give us some reasons why, and we'll see how some did and why they did and why others didn't, and some of the why behind that as well. Um, our first point, believe because of Jesus' teaching. Believe because of his teaching. Verse 14. But when it was now the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. Remember, last week his brothers were trying to persuade him to go with them to the feast. And not only to go to the feast, but to perform miracles, to do all these things publicly in such a way where everyone would believe his claims. Of course, they weren't only speaking about everyone else, they were also talking about themselves. They were skeptics. They had not yet come to believe in Jesus' claims. Jesus almost made it sound like he told them to go on without him, and it almost sounded like he wasn't going to go, which I think he may have wanted them to maybe even think that he wasn't going to go. So they went up without him, but it says Jesus waited and he went up a different way. So the feast that we're talking about, that's from last week, verse 2, the Feast of Booths. And we see here that Jesus was not scared. He was never scared of the people. He was not hiding, but he was making his timing perfect. He's going to do exactly what they were wanting him to do, but he's going to do it by in his way, on his timing. Not their way, not their timing. No one ever forced Jesus into something that he did not want to do. No man ever did so. Verse 15, the Jews were then astonished, saying, "How has this man become learned, having never been educated?" Now, that's about as a backhanded of a compliment as you could ever give to a person. They acknowledge that he's very knowledgeable, while also discounting his knowledge. It's a very popular thing in our world today, the belief that that you should not be listened to unless you have some type of a credential behind your name. You know, and even then it's, well, where were you educated at? You know, something that I couldn't help observing and I don't know why I didn't think about this until I went to college, but when I was in college, I just had the random thought to myself, anyone could come and buy any of these books and could read any of these books, and then they'd have the same knowledge that anyone who read these books would have. However, without they could have the knowledge but not the credentials. So what's important? What matters? Does it matter what you know? Or does it matter that you can prove that you went to a certain school? Well, common sense would tell us it matters what you know. It matters what you can do. But the world that we live in, and even in Jesus' time, said, well, no, unless you have the certification from this particular rabbi, unless you studied under a famous rabbi, then what makes you think that you know anything?
Do you think that any of the Jewish leadership at that time remember Jesus when he was 12 in the temple discussing things? They were like they were amazed with him then.
You know, if they did, they sure don't say anything about it.
I've never seen anything else said about that.
Yeah, and I bet that was more of like a one-off type occurrence.
They probably have no remembrance of that.
Yeah. And
Your son in here talking with all the
yeah, he amazed them. Yeah, he amazed them when he was 12. He amazed them, and it said that he amazed them at the questions that he was asking. And anyway, so it's funny that they don't think that because Jesus didn't study under a famous rabbi, in other words, they think there's no way he could be intelligent, which intelligence has nothing to do with who your teacher was. But after all, Jesus had the best teacher there was anyway, which none of them thought about. But notice this, finding no wrong with his teaching, they then turned to attack him. Like, well, yeah, his teaching might be amazing, but it's basically like this. They're like, well, he may be an amazing teacher, but he doesn't have a degree, so who cares? So they're attacking him, backhanded. You know, it's like, that doesn't make any sense. Jesus answers as only one with true humility can answer. I love Jesus' response to these guys. Verse 16, so Jesus answered them and said, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Jesus won't take credit for his teaching as his teaching, even though he could have. He knew these things. But he said, no, it's not my teaching. This is God's teaching. This is my Father's teaching. And I'm just sharing you his teaching, not my own. He's simply saying this isn't original. I'm just the messenger. He was more than the messenger. He was also the message. Some people, when others think they accomplished something great, they allow them to believe it, even when they know better. I have a little side note there in parentheses for my own good. It says Jim Malone. Now, I will confess to you tonight that I feel guilty using this example now because my old professor, Mr. Malone, he has since passed away. And I don't ever, it just makes me feel bad talking about someone who passed away. But I used to have this professor in college. His name was Jim Malone. And he and I, every class that I was in with him, he taught communications classes. And every class that I had with him, he and I ended up taking the whole class hostage. What I mean by that is he and I would have a discussion from the moment I went into class to the moment the class was over pretty much every day, and excluding everyone else. Now, that didn't bother me because I enjoyed it, but I think like those other people, I wonder if it drove everybody else crazy. I would think it would have. But very few times did anyone ever interject. And we like to argue with each other. He picked at me and picked on me. And but I gave it right back to him as best I could, as much as I could. And but I used to do something that got his goat worse than anything that I've ever seen someone do to a professor. And this is awful, but I was so proud of myself for this. I knew I could get his goat every time. See, because people would call Mr. Malone, who I call him Mr. Malone, is because he had a couple master's degrees, but he did not have a PhD. Okay? But several students would call him Dr. Malone. And if he wouldn't have bothered me so much, I wouldn't have said anything. But when they called him Dr. Malone, he allowed them to call him Dr. Malone. He never once said, I'm not a doctor, I don't have a PhD. So guess what I did? I said, no, don't call him Dr. Malone. Call him Mr. Malone. He doesn't have a PhD. And his face would turn about 50 shades of red. And, I mean, the look that he would give me. And I reveled in that. I don't know what that says about me or him, but we were both pretty childish. My point is, this reminded me of him because lots of people, if people think that they are something that they're not, a lot of people are just content to let people believe it. They're not humble. They don't say, well, no, you shouldn't attribute that to me. They just soak up the glory. Jesus claims here, look what he claims here. He claims to be a sent one. He says, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Now, a sent one, the word that you see in your New Testament that is a word that means sent one, literally, is the word apostle. That is literally what the word apostle means. So it doesn't mean that, because sometimes people will talk about the apostles, like, what's the difference between an apostle and a disciple? Well, all apostles are disciples, but not all disciples are apostles. Being an apostle, that just means that not only are you a learner and follower of Jesus, but you are also called to go out somewhere. And in that sense, to literally go out somewhere, to be sent from one place to another place in order to proclaim the good news. Jesus says that he is an apostle of God. God sent him. What I really don't want you to miss here, I don't want you to miss what I've referred to, and this might be a little controversial, but what I've referred to as the miracle of Jesus' teaching. And the reason I say his teaching is miraculous is because it was astonishing. I mean, think about it like this. You and I have never heard a perfect teacher before. Jesus was a perfect teacher. He never taught a single thing that had any falseness to it whatsoever. We can't relate to that because we've never personally heard that before. Because people are just imperfect. I try to do the very best I can in my teaching to be as accurate and as imperfect as possible, but I'm not perfect in my teaching. I know that, but Jesus was, and that's why it blew his hearers away when they heard him. Never was anyone also able to completely silence their opponents with words like Jesus was. Jesus knew exactly what to say to stop people dead in their tracks where they could not respond further, which is a special, unique talent. So, next, believe because of his teaching. Next, believe because of his desire. Because of his desire. Now, that's an interesting sounding thing. And to me, it's an interesting sounding thing to believe because of Jesus' desire. I didn't think before really studying this passage that was a reason to believe in Jesus. But look why I say that. Verse 17. Jesus said, if anyone is willing to do his will, God's will. So if you're willing to do God's will, he will know of the teaching, of Jesus' teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself. Now that's a weird test. That's a strange test. So Jesus is basically saying like this. Do you want to know if my teaching comes from God? Here's how you do it. If you are willing to do God's will, that enables you to know whether or not Jesus' teaching comes from God or not. That's a strange way to think about things. However, if you are not willing to do God's will, you open yourself up to believe all manner of false teachings. So, how does that apply to us? I want you to really get this point because I want to get this point. If I want to understand the Bible, I have to first be willing to do what it says. Then I will be able to understand it. It's part of what helps me to understand it is my willingness to believe it, to follow it, and to do it. You'd think that might be in reverse. And I think it may start off that way. It may start off, well, before I knew about the Bible, I wanted to know about it, so I began to read it. But as I began to read it, I slowly became willing to do what it said. And as I became willing to do what it said, I was enabled by God to understand more of it. How willing was Jesus to do God's will? And how did Jesus prove his desire? Let me answer it with a text, an interesting text that reminds me of Jesus. That's a text that's a personification of Jesus from the Old Testament. Proverbs chapter 1, verses 20 through 23. Wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones? Will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Now, replace wisdom, as wisdom is often personified in the Old Testament as a woman. It's just given that personification. But this is a perfect description of Jesus in his ministry. Jesus shouts out in the streets. He lifts his voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets, Jesus cried out. He taught. At the entrance of the gates in the city, he uttered his sayings, God's sayings. And he taught the same thing. How long? How long are you not going to believe? How long are you going to be simple-minded? Scoffers delight themselves in scoffing. How long? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing. How long will fools hate knowledge? Here, I see Jesus called wisdom. The naive, the simple-minded scoffers, notice this, they are not fools because they lack the ability to understand. Nothing that is worth knowing, the most important things that are worth knowing in the Bible are not hard things to understand. And you're not a fool because you don't have the ability. They are fools because they're not willing to do the will of God. That's what makes you a fool. Not being willing to follow. And if you're unwilling to follow, that will make you unteachable. So you're just hearing words. You're hearing teachings. But if you're unwilling to follow, it's not going to do you any good. Next, believe because of his humility. Believe because of Jesus' humility. Verse 18, he who speaks from himself seeks his own glory. But he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Of course, this is Jesus. When he talks like this, because of his humility, you notice he doesn't say I, but he is talking about himself. When he says there is no unrighteousness in him, he's talking about himself. Unlike others with tremendous ability, Jesus sought no glory. That's the thing that we've always seen in the history of our world. If someone has an ability to do something, they don't keep it quiet, and they take full credit for it. Look at what I'm good at. They may not say those words, but they demonstrate it to people. Look what I'm good at. And too often, they take the credit for whatever they're good at. Do you take the credit for what you're good at? Nothing wrong with being good at doing things. God made us all uniquely good at doing things. However, he never intended for us to take the glory for the ability to do those things. It's God who gives us those abilities. And we're to thank him and praise him for what we're able to do, what wisdom we have, what abilities we have. Don't give yourself credit for that. Give God credit for that. That's what Jesus did. Jesus allowed a small amount of glory to be given him when he was on this earth, but only when God directed him to do so. Humility is more than not seeking your own glory. Humility is also actively seeking to glorify God. And John the Baptist gives us the best example of this. John chapter 3, verse 30, when John says, Jesus must increase, I must decrease. You see, a lot of times people will think humility means decreasing myself. But that's only part of humility, is my decrease. It's not one or the other, it's both. True humility lifts God up while decreasing myself. How humble was Jesus? Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, being found in appearance as a man, He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus was willing to face not only death, and it's one thing that we may not think about as much either when we consider Jesus' death, but a humiliating death. Not just, it's one thing. Think about this. If I were going to be crucified, that'd be a terrible, terrible thing, I would think. But if someone said, not only are you going to be crucified, Wes, you're going to be crucified in front of all the people of Wellington in your underwear. That's a different level of humility, of humiliation, isn't it? Jesus wasn't just crucified, he was crucified naked. He's wearing a loincloth thing, but they stripped him. So I say that just to say this. It wasn't just dying for our sins in a terribly excruciating way. It was a humiliating, excruciating way. In his humility, he accepted that, and unlike other people, unlike anyone else who ever lived that was crucified, he had the ability to stop it at any time, at any moment, and didn't. So he was willing to decrease to the point of ultimate humiliation in order for God to be ultimately glorified at his resurrection. Next, believe in Jesus because of your need. This is probably my top reason, my biggest reason for believing Jesus, believing his words and believing in who he is, because I have a great need that goes unfulfilled without him. Verse 19, Jesus said, now this is some tricky stuff here, so just bear with me. Jesus says, did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you carries out the law? No, I'm not to the tricky part yet. Hold on, bear with me, I will get there. Why do you seek to kill me? So it does say something interesting here too. It says, there's no subtlety here either. He says, you accuse me of being a lawbreaker. I'm not a lawbreaker. You are a lawbreaker. He's calling them all hypocrites. You seek to kill me, but you don't first examine yourself. None of you, Jesus is saying, none of you know the law, but none of you can follow it. What's your excuse? Why can't you follow it? Well, there's usually a couple reasons for that. Number one, the law is too hard to follow perfectly. Even if you desire that more than anything else, the law was too difficult to follow perfectly. Paul says the greatest thing that the law ever did was it showed us what terrible sinners that we were. And it showed us what our great need was. And also, here's the flip side of that coin. Living perfectly is too hard because we like sin too much. That's the other reason. Psalm 14, verses 1 through 3 says, there is none who does good. The Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all encompassing there, all means all. Everyone has turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. No perfect people, what the psalm is saying. This is what Paul quotes when Paul teaches these same things in our New Testament. He's quoting Psalm chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. That is our great need. None of us have the capability to do good. We can do a little bit of good. We can do good deeds. We can do good for a little while. Selfishness usually ultimately takes over. James chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. In regards to sin, James says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by what? By his own lust. No using the excuse, the devil made me do it. Most of us sin because when we sin, most of us do it without any temptation needed. It comes from right here, comes from our heart. From our heart, and then out of our mouth and through our deeds, in the way that we think. Verse 20, the crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who seeks to kill you?" Now, notice this. This is the crowd. This is the crowd saying this to Jesus, not the religious leaders. Because the religious leaders, they've been forming a plot for a long time to kill Jesus. But all the regular people, they don't know that. The regular people, they haven't been trying to form a plot to kill Jesus. Just the religious leaders have. See, Jesus knew that the leaders had been plotting to kill him, but the regular citizens, they didn't have any clue about that. And the regular citizens are the ones that say to him, "Who seeks to kill you?" But before they said, "Who seeks to kill you?" they said, "You have a demon. You are demon possessed." This accusation catches fire. And then from this moment on, for the rest of Jesus' life, which on this earth, which is not going to be that much longer, we're in the last 6 months of his life right now in John, this is going to be the accusation that comes up time and time again. Someone thinks, "Hey, that's a great idea. Whoever yelled out he has a demon, let's run with that. Let's continue to say that he's demon possessed," because we're going to see it get repeated.
It's hard to see anything he had said that would lead to that.
Oh yeah.
How'd they even get that in their head?
No, what on earth? Yeah, what on earth could he have said? As Rex was saying, what on earth did he say that would make people say that he's demon possessed? He didn't say any. Did nothing like a demon possessed person. So it's a strange thing. Anyway, name calling always means whoever resorts to name calling first is what we used to say back in debate. Whoever resorts to name calling first automatically loses. So, next, believe because of his deeds. Believe because of the deeds of Jesus. Verse 21, Jesus answered them, "I did one deed, and you all marvel." So, Jesus hasn't been in Jerusalem for a long time. So what is the one deed, what one deed is he referring to here? What is the last deed that he did in Jerusalem? It's also the same reason why he left Jerusalem. So let me just backtrack you to that deed that he's referring to. John chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. Jesus said to this man on the Sabbath, "Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk." Immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." What kind of a hard-hearted fool witnesses a person who hasn't walked standing up, walking, and says, "You can't walk around on the Sabbath. You can't do that." I mean, these are some hard-hearted people. Of course, that's why Jesus did that particular miracle on that particular day, not to heal this man. That wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose was to provoke the evil in these guys' hearts so that it would ultimately lead to his crucifixion. Jesus provoked them on purpose. But that still does not excuse their thinking and their reasoning. Verses 22 and 3, Jesus said, and this is the part that I said was confusing. Then Jesus says this, "For this reason Moses has given you circumcision, not because it is from Moses, but from the fathers." Now remember, circumcision goes all the way back to Abraham, which is hundreds of years before the law is given to Moses, and it's included in the law. And on the Sabbath, Jesus is saying, when a male baby's, the babies that are born 8 days before the Sabbath, they're always circumcised on the 8th day. So Jesus says, on the Sabbath, you circumcise a man. So he's saying, just because it's Sabbath doesn't keep you from going through with circumcision, because it's commanded in the law that on the 8th day that the males are circumcised. However, so he's basically saying, what's your excuse for doing that work on the Sabbath? You're doing something. You basically teach you're not allowed to do anything on the Sabbath, but you do that. So what's your justification behind that? So he continues. So that's how he starts his argument. Then he says this, verse 23, if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath? And you're willing to maim a man on the Sabbath. I'm willing to completely heal a man on the Sabbath. And you say you're not a lawbreaker and that I'm a lawbreaker. So, Jesus says that Moses made circumcision part of the law. Well, he did because God told him to, but circumcision was included as part of the covenant law, and Jesus says it's because it started before him. But Jesus is saying this, that circumcision existed before the law, was given, so you esteem circumcising on the 8th day is more important than not breaking the Sabbath. And that's your reasoning. He's saying that's your train of thought. Because circumcision was given before the law was given, you say that was more important. However, truth be told, Jesus was teaching them, you're not breaking the Sabbath when the 8th day falls on the Sabbath. But your interpretation of the Sabbath is completely wrong. You're wrong. You don't understand why God gave it to you. You've turned the Sabbath into a bunch of rule following. The purpose of the Sabbath is that you focus on God. That's the purpose of the Sabbath. To rest in God, to worship God, and to honor God. To have a time where you take your attention away from the tedious things of this life and put your attention on God. But even Jesus said in another place, he said, which one of you, if your ox falls in a ditch on the Sabbath, doesn't go get him out? He says, you know every single one of you does that. It's common sense. When you're not breaking the Sabbath if you do that. The point of the Sabbath is not for you not to do that. The point of the Sabbath is that you don't just have it as a regular day where you do all your regular stuff, where you work all day. But he's ultimately saying as well, and you are wrong in believing that I broke God's law as well. You think that I broke God's law by healing a man on the Sabbath? I'm here to tell you, that's not breaking the law. Healing someone is not breaking God's law. That seems so common sense and ridiculous. But, verse 24, last verse, Jesus says, do not judge according to appearance. There's all the people in the world who love to say, Christians, even people that don't know anything about the Bible know that there's verses that say do not judge. But they don't know the whole verse ever, do they? There's a couple places where the Bible talks about not judging, but it never. But not judging is always qualified, and Jesus does it here as well. He doesn't just say do not judge and then put a period and then walk away. He says do not judge according to appearance. That's the wrong way to judge. That's what he's saying. Don't ever look at a person's appearance and draw judgments about that person based on their appearance. What do every single one of us do? To everybody. And that doesn't have to, you don't have to draw a negative or a bad judgment. We just make judgments about people based on their appearance. If you come into church tonight and you're wearing coveralls and you're covered from head to toe in dirt and grease and grime, I make a judgment that you've been working. Now, that's not a negative judgment, but I see that you're covered in filth. You're wearing work clothes. I made a judgment that you've been working. Now, I may be completely wrong. You may just put them on and rolled around in the mud. Doesn't mean that you worked. So he says, don't judge according to appearance. Of course, we're talking about deeper judgments, aren't we? We're talking about judging people's hearts. We're judging who they are. We're judging the deep things about people. That's what Jesus is really getting at there. Don't judge people do not judge according to appearance. Here's how you do judge, though. But judge with righteous judgment. Make sure that you're right before you draw conclusions about people. Weigh the evidence of the person. Get to know who the person is, what they're about. You know, there's probably a person, it's probably true of all of us, that there has been a person, or there is a person, that we don't like only because we caught that person on a bad day. Have you ever not liked someone because you caught them on a bad day, but then later on you did like that person? That's happened to me several times in my life by weird circumstances. There were some people, I'm thinking a lot of times about people that I got a bad first impression when I met someone, but then later on down the road I had another interaction with the person and I really liked them. But it was hard for me to really like them because I still had that bad impression in my mind. But what I did first off is I judged them based on a very little small amount of information. Now we all do that, and that's hard not to do. But that's not a righteous judgment. Someone could just be having a bad day. Find out what people are all about. Jesus is telling them, listen to my teaching. Listen to my teaching. Observe what I do. Based on what you see me do, based on what you hear me say, then make your judgments. That's what he's telling the crowd. He's telling them to judge him. Make a judgment about me, but not based on what somebody said about me. Make a judgment about me yourself based on who I show you that I am. And Jesus showed us who he was through his words, through the way he lived his life, through the miracles that he performed, through his teaching. He proved to us that we could put our faith in him and believe he was who he claimed to be. All right, well, we will continue in this time in Jesus' life next week. If anyone has a reason to respond to invitation tonight, we always want you to know you can do that. If it's convenient for you, let's stand as we sing number 851. And if anyone needs to respond or wants to respond, feel free to do so as we sing this song.